Welcome to this Lambert Smith Hampton landmark seminar on the RAMM case. Colin Hunter was the expert witness in the case for the Exeter City Council. I was the barrister. The issues that we're going to be addressing in this talk are fundamentally focused on public buildings occupied other than for profit, but the principles we're going to be talking about also cover charitable organisations, social organisations and similar. A bit of housekeeping first of all, if I may. First of all, can you make sure your microphones are automatically muted, and please don't try to adjust those. We very much welcome questions. At the bottom of your screen you should see a question and answer tab, and if you have any questions just type them into there and we will either address them at the end or during our talks, or if they're very specific we may have to deal with them separately after the webinar has finished. This webinar is being recorded, and at the end of it you'll receive a link both to the slideshow and to the video. If your connection's lost at any point, then all you need to do is just close the window and then go back to the link that you've been sent and just start again, and you'll be automatically, I hope, automatically let back in. So with that introduction, I think we can probably, as long as those controlling the background are happy that everyone's in from the waiting room, I think I can probably take over control of the screen. And I can, and I'm going to kick off with a talk dealing with the legal principles from RAMM and the legal issues that might arise in terms of how RAMM might be capable of being relied on for the future. So the purpose of this webinar, first of all, and the starting point is that the VOA, and I know a lot of members of the VOA are on this call, the VOA sought permission to appeal the RAMM case to the Court of Appeal, setting out in very great detail the very significant implications of this case on the rating of public buildings. And they said in terms to the Court of Appeal that the decision in RAMM potentially put billions of pounds of RV at risk. And as I'm going to show you through the next 20 minutes or so, I think they were right to be very concerned. I think that the RAMM case has potentially massive and wide-ranging implications across the public sector rating environment as to three matters. First of all, as to valuation methodology. Secondly, as to affordability and how that can play out where there is no statutory duty to carry out a particular function. Affordability will become, in the light of RAMM, will become highly relevant. And thirdly, how the treatment of grants is to be addressed in the light of the way RAMM dealt with affordability and the Sports Council case. So those are the three big issues. And the real question is, well, the purpose of this seminar is to examine how those implications might arise, and we're going to do it in the following way. First of all, we're going to assess the RAMM case. It's a hugely difficult case to read. It's a very, very detailed legal analysis, and I won't be able to do it all justice in the 20 minutes or so, and I'm going to have to paraphrase a lot of the detail. And so I'll be dealing with the legal principles in the case, and we'll be looking at the implications for old museums. But obviously most people on this call won't be interested just in old museums, and the question then becomes, what are the implications for rating much more widely of public buildings not occupied for profit? And at the end we'll also be addressing questions such as affordability, the relevance of affordability, and the relevance of grant funding. So I'm going to start with the legal principles and how they played out in the RAMM case. Colin's then going to go into the expert evidence that he presented and give some case studies. And then we're going to get together, the two of us, and ask each other questions about how the principles might be extended to other cases. At the end, there's going to be about a 10-minute slot for us to answer any questions we can. I keep on saying RAMM, by the way, and I've immediately been asked, what does RAMM mean? RAMM means the Royal Albert Memorial Museum and Art Centre Gallery, which is a 19th century building in Exeter owned by the City Council. Okay, so the essential background. We all know that the contractor's basis is meant to be a last resort, but for the vast majority of public buildings, it seemed to become hardened as a first resort, ubiquitously used to value buildings occupied other than for profit and for socio-economic purposes, such as we want a museum because it's good for our population, or we want a museum to encourage tourism, or we want a sports centre because we want our children to have somewhere to go and to keep fit. The contractor's basis, or a variant of it, is used to value a huge proportion of the public buildings in England and Wales. It often throws up very high and sometimes, in my experience, anomalous results. Whilst it's supposed to act as a ceiling, it's almost impossible to know how to work back from the ceiling to the RV. As we know from multiple examples, the adjustments at stage 5 of the contractor spaces, there's just simply no metric or no method to allow you to be confident as to the adjustments at that stage. Despite all of that, there was limited challenge to the use of the contractor's basis for socio-economic buildings, mainly because of the way local authority budgeting works, with the museum or the sports centre being given a budget which has as a direct cost and a direct cost out and a direct input in the rates bill. And so nobody had control of the rates exposure and therefore no incentive to challenge it. The result has been that the practice of use of the contractor's basis has become the default approach. And it became so embedded that in the RAMM case, the VO tried to argue that the contractor's basis had hardened into a principle of law. The first round in the debate about whether that was correct was York Museums. The approach to the contractor's basis was so embedded that the Valuation Office Agency challenged any attempt to depart from it, even where there was rental evidence, and even where that rental evidence provided a hook to justify, for example, a receipts and expenses approach. In York Museums, Colin demonstrated that there was some limited rental evidence that showed that socioeconomic buildings were not valued and the rents were not set by reference to the contractor's basis, but were arrived at by reference to the turnover potential or the receipts and expenses potential. And in the York Museums case, the Lands Chamber, Martin Rogers QC and Mr. McRae largely agreed with Colin's analysis and confirmed that the contractor's basis did not have to be used in all evidence if there was, in all cases, if there was evidence to justify a different approach. There was no appeal, and you might think, therefore, that that point of principle, do you have to use the contractor's basis, had been settled. But it turned out that wasn't how the VO, the Valuation Office, saw it. The Valuation Office saw it saw it as simply the first battle, the first round of the battle. And as we'll see in the RAMM case, the Lands Chamber was highly surprised that if there was a point of such high principle, why on earth was York Museums not appealed rather than waiting for a second bite of the cherry in RAMM? In RAMM, the VTE, the Valuation Tribunal for England, was based on the York Museums case, and the VTE imposed a rateable value of just £1, pretty standard application of York Museums. But even though the valuation officer had not appealed York Museums, it did appeal the RAMM decision and basically said, using a second bite of the cherry, saying that the RAMM VTE and the Lands Chamber in York Museums was wrong in principle on the basic point that buildings that were occupied other than for profit and for socio-economic reasons had to be valued on the contractor's basis as a matter of law. And the receipts and expenditure basis was not available because it could not reflect socio-economic value. The case was heard by Mr. Justice Holgate and Mr. Trott, and as one would expect with a court of that composition and a test case that was said to be worth billions, the judgment has a minute dissection of case law going right back to 1886, right up to York museums, and case law both in Scotland and in England, and most cases in between. I'm sorry, that's when you read that bit of RAMM, I'm afraid those 100 or so paragraphs are my fault. I asked the court to look at all the principles going back right back to square one. In terms of the essential facts, there was no statutory duty to run the museum, so we're not in a situation the same as schools, where there is a statutory duty to provide adequate school places. This was a 19th century grand listed building that needed huge expenditure on repairs over the years. It had been originally funded by charitable donations in the 1860s, I think, but very quickly the charity found it couldn't afford to run it, and so it gave the building for free to the city council. Exeter City Council then owned and financially supported it because of the socio-economic benefits. It secured very, very low income, had very high running costs, and therefore there was a need for a large subsidy. In 2006, the building underwent huge refurbishment at, I think, a total cost of something like £21 million or similar. And whilst it was partly lottery funded, a lot of it had to come from Exeter City Council's budget. The rateable value was set by the valuation officer purely on the contractor's basis, based on the costs of construction of a modern alternative. And I do need to put in a word of warning here. The only part of the case where we came unstuck was on our modern equivalent under the contractor's basis. And we were trying to show that anyone building a museum in Exeter in 21st century would build it much smaller and much more efficiently than in the 19th. And we lost on that point because our evidence was not sufficiently robust, not sufficiently expert. And so a word of warning there as to how you go about modern equivalent valuations, but I don't have time to spend more time on that here. So the competing positions were, the VOA position was that where a property was occupied other than for profit and for socio-economic reasons, the contractor's basis had to be applied. There was no scope in principle to use the receipts and expenses basis because it could not reflect the socio-economic benefits and would always result in an RV of £1, even when the building or the occupation of the building was of huge value to the public body concerned. They said that the high capital expenditure in 2006 on a massive refurbishment reflected how valued the building, the museum was to Exeter. They said that grants and affordability could not be taken into account on the facts, despite the fact that the museum already cost Exeter about 10% of its annual budget. And they set out a valuation on a standard contractor's basis only. So they put all of their eggs into the contractor's basis basket, and they didn't come up with any other valuation approaches. And we'll see that the Lands Chamber effectively criticised them for not doing so and suggested that other valuation approaches might have been sensible to put forward. And because there was the contractor's basis had to be used as a matter of law, there was no attempt by the valuation officer to assess the socio-economic value. And whenever you see a number in brackets, by the way, that's a reference to a paragraph number of the judgment. As a result of that very strict approach, no alternative valuations, no overbid, no share of receipts or anything like that, none of those methods were put forward before the Lands Chamber by the valuation officer. But the Lands Chamber did say, well, actually, if they've been presented, they might be worthy of further consideration. So that's a warning, I guess, for later cases, that it might not be as stark as you go to the R&E. It might be that you go to something like a share of receipts or an overbid situation. The competing position put forward by Colin and me for the city was that there was no rule of law or rating principle that you had to use the contractor's basis. Indeed, on the contrary, the choice of method had to be driven just by the evidence. And the question I posed was there an evidential hook for the use of a valuation method? And here there was a valuation hook, we said, because there was limited rental evidence that showed that rents were being set by reference to trading potential and not the costs of construction. So in other words, they were set by reference to the R&E and not by reference to the costs, but not by reference to the contractor's basis. We further said that in order to determine what valuation method was to be preferred and how to weigh the rival methods, a range of factors which would influence the negotiations in the real world or in the hypothetical world, and how well a particular valuation method fit with those factors would impact the choice of method and the weight to be attached to it. And of course, those factors would include things like the mode or category of occupation, who was the hypothetical tenant, how many potential hypothetical tenants there were in the market, the supply of premises, how many potential museums there were in the market, the circumstances in which the ratepayer came to occupy the building. Here, it had been given it for free because it was about to go bust. The basis of the occupation, was it for profit or for socioeconomic reasons? How intense the responsibilities of ownership were. For example, here, the listed building had to be subject to very extensive repairs and ongoing liabilities. And finally, the affordability of rent. And as we'll see in a moment, that becomes a really quite key factor. All of those factors on the facts of the museum, the RAMM museum here, pointed strongly against the contractor's basis and strongly in favour of the receipts and expenditure. The city was the only possible bidder. Its ability to pay was fundamental. It had huge and onerous responsibilities in respect to the occupation already, even if it wasn't paying any rent. A landowner with the building would be delighted to get rid of it. The council could not afford even the existing subsidy, never mind increasing the subsidy by making cuts elsewhere. And the judge held that the city could not be expected to spend more of its money on renting RAMM. And it seems to me that that's a pretty fundamental conclusion. You need to read the paragraph 69 to 71 carefully, but local authorities up and down the country are cutting discretionary commitments all over the place. And where they keep them at as low a level as possible. And every budgeting exercise I've ever seen for local authorities always says, okay, we'll keep the swimming pool or we'll keep the leisure centre only because we feel we have to, but we've got to cut costs dramatically on it because otherwise we just simply can't afford it. In that context, it seems to me that this case, the RAMM case, allows in affordability to all discretionary held public service buildings. In my view, that is a sharp contrast to the position in the Eastbourne case on its leisure centres. The conclusions of law of the tribunal were that we won on every point. This was a test case that was being brought by the valuation officer, and its second bite of the cherry, trying to re-raise these arguments again, has, I say, spectacularly backfired on it, because the judgment is more powerful and the law now much more clear and more clearly against the VO than previously. Every circumstance and all evidence relevance to the hypothetical, to the rating hypothesis must be taken into account. The selection of valuation method is a matter of valuation judgment, not of law. Valuation methods are just a tool or a guide for assessing rateable value under the rating hypothesis and are not a substitute for the rating hypothesis. As a result, there is no general legal principle which requires contractor's basis as opposed to R&E in any situation. It's all a matter of evidence. All the factors that we'd listed, that I went through a moment ago, were relevant. They all went to the weight to be attached to each valuation method, and all of them here pointed to contractor's basis. socioeconomic value did not accrue. And again, this is a fundamental point. Everyone says local authorities have public buildings because of the socioeconomic value to them. The court said, hang on, it's not socioeconomic value to them, it's socioeconomic value to the community. And the leap of faith that the council would pay in rent the full value of the socioeconomic benefits to the wider community in rent was a non sequitur and was simply wrong. And again, you can see there that that is a fundamental departure from the assumption that as soon as you have socioeconomic value, it justifies the contractor's basis. The appeal was refused, and the effects are the ones that I've set out there. In particular, in all public buildings now, it's necessary to consider whether contractor's basis is required to be applied or whether there's some evidential base to adopt a different approach or to allow in a different valuation methodology. Affordability has come centre stage, and I have to say that our evidence in RAMM was not anything other than any local authority in the country could produce in terms of the evidence. It was just a basic standard. We're hard up, our budget is fully committed. If we spent more on a museum, we'd have to spend less on sports, for example. We can't do that, it would be politically impossible, therefore we can't pay the rent. It was really quite as simple as that. I therefore think that the case has given a whole new lease of life to the ability of local authorities to pay the rent, the hypothetical rent. It also raises really quite starkly the question as to how this all fits with grant-funded buildings. We know that the reason grants are used for lots of public buildings is that without the grant, the local authority simply wouldn't be able to afford to build the building. Or without the grant, it simply wouldn't decide that it was a priority to have the building. And we know from the lottery funding that a whole wad of new buildings are built since about 2000 that simply would never have been built without the grants. And one therefore questions how that may play out in the post-RAMM world. Are the grants deemed to be available to pay the rent? Or are they really a manifestation of the non-affordability of the building? And it seems to me there's a respectable argument that it's the latter. Okay, the final thing I need to talk about, I've only got 1 more minute left, but the final thing I like to talk about, and we're going to be asking each other questions about this in a moment, is what are the knock-on consequences? And I think that it's absolutely clear that the case has the potential for the principles to be applied much more widely. Indeed, the VO seems to think the same, because he said that it put billions of pounds of RV at risk. And you can just walk around any town and you can see the range of public buildings that might be affected. Indeed, I looked a bit odd last night doing exactly that. I just walked around my town to see the sorts of buildings that might potentially be affected. With the RAMM judgment in my hand, you've got art centres, you've got schools, you've got leisure centres, you've got town halls, you've got community centres, care centres, premises for clubs and societies, the Scouts, CCF buildings, old people's day centres, the whole range of public buildings that are occupied other than for profit and for socioeconomics, potentially have the potential to be affected by the RAMM decision. Now, before I finish, I should stress that the judgment in RAMM says that it applies only to old museums, and I don't for 1 second depart from that. But the principles that led to the judgment seem to me to be, first of all, entirely right, and of much wider application. Right, that's me 2 minutes over my time. I think I will now hand over to Colin, hopefully. Yes, thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. As you can see, I'm Colin Hunter. The photograph and everything else seems to match. I'm just trying to get control of the screen now. There we go. Okay, so following on, we've looked at the legal side of things and the legal principles. My real concern here is the practical valuation side of things. So what I'm going to try and cover off as quickly as I can is valuation issues, mode and category of use, methods of valuation, rental evidence, receipts and expenditure, contractor's method, case studies, and impact on other property types. So I may have to speak very, very quickly to get through all of this. So this picture here is RAMM. This is Royal Albert Memorial Museum. So what are the valuation issues arising? We've got the mode and category of use question. We have the methods of valuation. We have evidence. And we have the impact on other property types. So starting with mode or category of use. Fundamental question when we're doing any valuation is, what is it? What is it used for? Which is the cart and which is the horse when we're looking at these things? What drives the valuation? The answer to that has got to be, it's the mode and category of use. It's the use of the building that has to drive the valuation. That has to come first. There's a quote in the RAMM decision where the VO attempted to define use of a particular subsect of museums on the basis of it had to be done on contractor's basis. And that is definitely putting the cart before the horse. We've got to look at the question of use in a slightly broader category. So taking a quote from case law, a shop is a shop, not any particular type of shop. So we're not trying to cheese pair this down. We're not trying to look at this in terms of museums being split into smaller and smaller groups. We're saying museums and galleries are a broad category. And the same applies to all other categories of mode or category of use. But there's also the fact that they fit within an even bigger category, which to my mind is visitor attractions. Alternative uses. There is a mention in the decision that perhaps alternative use value can be looked at. And again, that's where the wider category would fit in. But we've got to be realistic. We've got to look at what the building is. We've got to look at what the uses are before we start saying, oh, well, it can be something else. This becomes an important point because the valuation office are now considering whether or not, rather than looking at receipts and expenditure as a fallback position, they should be looking at the historic building, taking into account the collection that's in the building, working out what the cost of a storage space would be for the collection within the building, uplifting that in some way, shape or form, and then calling that the value of the building. Now that to my mind is completely wrong because we're not valuing a store, we're valuing a museum or a gallery. Methods of valuation you've heard mentioned. We've got rental comparison, we have receipts and expenditure, and we have contractor's method. Now I would suggest quite strongly that's the order in which we should look for them. We then have other methods. Other methods include all sorts of weird and wonderful different ways of looking at things. We've got a simplified approach of taking a percentage of receipts. We've got some properties, such as theatres, which are done on the number of seats within the theatre. We've got double bedroom units as a measure for hotels. We've got single bed space as a measure for holiday lets. All of these things can be looked at. What we didn't look at for RAMM, which we were told we should have done, is this question of an overbid because of the socio-economic benefit to the occupier. Now that's something that wasn't raised by the other side, and for obvious reasons, if I didn't have to answer a question, I didn't attempt to answer it. But it is something going forward that we are going to have to consider, and we'll need to build that in, but we need to put that into the context of the other valuation methods that we can adopt. Rental evidence has got to be the key in any starting point. As you've heard, for the museum sector, we've got quite a limited amount of evidence. I undertook a national trawl using the resources of the Association of Independent Museums in 2012 to try and find some rental evidence. The Valuation Office have done a trawl of their own records. and again come up with a limited amount of evidence. And we put that evidence before the tribunal. It's not just a question of what limited evidence we've got, it's a question of, is it capable of analysis? And having analysed it, how do we apply it? So what use is it if we can't analyse it, if we can't apply it? Well, in the case of RAMM and the other museums cases, so York, for example, what we did was we looked at the evidence, and I looked behind the evidence to see how it had been arrived at, because I might not be able to analyse it and reapply it to a different property. But if I know how the market actually approached the valuation for the rent, why on earth would I approach the valuation for rating on any other basis? And it seemed to me that there was a very solid argument to say the rental evidence proved that we should be looking at receipts and expenditure. None of it, absolutely none of it, came level with where we'd have been if we were looking at contractor's basis. So even if we can't apply the rental evidence, it's of extreme use to us in making sure that we know what we're actually doing in the valuation exercise. So looking at receipts and expenditure then. First question is, what's the source of financial information that we're going to use? This can be a bit of a problem because with a lot of not-for-profit occupations, the accounts are actually set out as a consolidated account, whereas what we need to look at is purely profit and loss. It's also a problem when we look at things like Royal Albert Memorial Museum with no entry charge for the visitors. So how do we account for the fact that there's a potential income stream there that hasn't been tapped? We need to then think about what's the fair maintainable trade when we're looking at receipts and expenditure. So it's no good taking a snapshot of 1 year. We've got to look across a number of years and ask ourselves a sensible question of projecting forward from the valuation date. What is the reasonable level of trade that we can expect to get? How would we expect this to move forward in the future? And that can be quite an interesting challenge, just trying to get to that sort of figure from the information that we get in terms of the accounts. We also need to think about depreciation. Strictly speaking, within receipts and expenditure for rating, we wouldn't look at depreciation. But what we would look at would be a return on the tenants' fixtures and fittings, their chattels and so on and so forth, rather than the building itself, because they need to have a return on that. And actually the easiest way of getting to that from the accounts is just to look at what's been written down in the accounts. So there's a bit of a cheat to use the depreciation, but it's useful and it's a good guide for where we need to be. At the end of the receipts and expenditure calculation, we come to what they call a divisible balance, which we would really just call the net profit or the net surplus at the end of the accounts run. And that can be divided between the landlord and the tenant. And it's a question of who gets what from that division. Now, with something like RAMM, it's a simple calculation because it's such a huge negative figure. There is nothing to divide between the landlord and tenant, no rent to be paid. When we look at other examples, we can have a look and see how that goes. Contractor's method. Now, this is a tried and tested method. I mean, it is a method of last resort, but it has a good history behind it and it's got its uses. It has its place in the scheme of things. It's a 5-stage approach. So stage 1, you look at your replacement building, what it would cost to put it up. That's stage 1. Stage 2, you then say, yeah, but we're not valuing that building, we're valuing this building, the actual building, not the original building. So at stage 2, you make adjustments and allowances for the fact that you have age and obsolescence to take into account, and that splits down into 3 separate categories in its own right. So we have those 2 stages. Third stage brings into account the cost of the land, fees, adjustments for location, and other similar factors. Stage 4 is set for us by statute. We have a statutory decapitalisation rate, and we apply that. There is no choice of decapitalisation rate, it's fixed. But there is, of course, a question of what is reflected in that. We then come on to stage 5, and stage 5 is effectively, you've got an end figure, now step back and look, and is this realistic? Is this sensible? What have we not taken into account in the first 4 stages that should be taken into account by any reasonable tenant taking the building? We have these adjustments, as I said, at stages 1, 2 and 5. The adjustment at stage 1 was referred to in terms of the lack of quality evidence that we actually provided for RAMM, and I take full responsibility for that. When we're looking at stage 1, the question is, what are we valuing at that stage? And what we should be valuing is a simple replacement building, a simple modern replacement building. Not necessarily a grand edifice. If you go back in your mind to the picture I showed you of RAMM, there is no way you could describe that as a simple building. And there is no way you would actually rebuild that building if you're going to put up a modern equivalent today. So what would be the size of the modern building? And that can be a really difficult thing to get into. You need to have the expertise behind you to actually be able to do the design. But I do raise the question of, was it worth the exercise because of the cost of doing such an exercise? And I don't think we could justify the cost of bringing in an expert who designs museums to deal with the RAMM case. But it may well be something to be looked at for other cases going forward. When does it become nonsense? Any valuation that needs massive amounts of adjustment has got to be given very careful thought. If you get to the point where at stage 5 you're going to knock off 90% of the value because it's 90% wrong, does that render the whole exercise nonsensical? In my view it does, and I said so under cross-examination on 2 occasions, in York and in the RAMM case. I don't think there's any sense in coming to an end figure and then having them massively adjusted because it doesn't fit reality, when you've got an alternative method of valuation which will fit reality. Grant funding. As mentioned by David, grant funding can be seen as either being something that's been there potentially available to pay a rent, or the reality of grant funding that it's there because there is no other way of funding the development. Now, I would suggest that grant funding is very definitely a sign of ability to pay issues. If you can't afford to build it, you can't afford to rent it. So this is something that we need to bring into account. Now, there is this case, Sports England case, otherwise known as the Bisham Abbey case, because the property concerned was Bisham Abbey. It was a sports centre for the training of athletes aimed at the 2012 Olympics. It was brought up to a very high modern standard, and a lot of money was spent on it. And most of the funding came out of the lottery. That would never have happened without the lottery funding, should it have been taken into account. And the answer that was given originally by the Upper Tribunal Lands Chamber was no, it shouldn't be taken into account. The answer we have now is yes, it should have been, and that original decision for Bisham Abbey was wrong. We'll have to see how that plays out over time, because I know for certain that the Valuation Office don't agree with what I've just said. So evidence. Evidence is the key. We start with the rental evidence if we can get it. We analyse it, we look at where it came from, and we try and understand it as best we possibly can. Financial information, I've already explained that that can be a bit of an issue. Looking at how that evidence is put together, understanding the finances, understanding how moving forward we should be looking at the fair maintainable trade and not necessarily a fluctuating situation that we've had in the past. Visitor numbers become important because if we don't have admissions charges, we have to adjust the income information to take into account the potential income from visitors. And of course, visitor numbers are across a demographic. So when you're looking at visitors, are you talking about full paying adults? Are you talking about children under 5 who are free? Are you talking about other children who are at a discounted rate? Students, group visits? So you need to be able to adjust those figures and think about it. There's also the question mark of, if this is a free entry and you then start to charge, What happens to your visitor numbers? How do you need to adjust them? So there's a good bit of work needs to be done on this evidence to understand it before we can use it in our valuations. Socioeconomic impact. The only way to actually measure socioeconomic impact is to look at the economic impact on the locality. There is no measure that we have which is particularly accurate. There is a useful toolkit produced by the Association of Independent Museums which gives you an indication of where we are. And that's normally used to justify either grants that have already been paid, grants that you're hoping to get, or funding that you're holding your hand out for to a third party, quite often the local authority. So it measures a financial impact, but it measures a financial impact not to the property, not to the occupier, but to the locality. And there is no mechanism I know of that we can use to actually convert from one to the other. But it's certainly something that needs looking at and thinking about, because if there is a massive socioeconomic benefit to the locality, then yes, the local authority occupier might well be willing to pay a bit over the odds in order to get that benefit to their taxpayers, their council taxpayers, their ratepayers. Very quickly looking at the case studies then. Castle Museum, if you can see the pointer on the screen, this is Castle Museum here, this L shape of buildings. This is two prison buildings, both from the 18th century. The wall at the back was the city castle. That was York Castle's medieval wall. And of course the building in the foreground here is Clifford's Tower, which is the old keep from the castle. So we have a very historic site. We have historic buildings, they're Grade 1 listed, but you're sat right in the middle of the tourist location. Clifford's Tower is a tourist icon for York. We had a rateable value of 183,000 on contractor's basis. We had a long way around to get there with the valuation office splitting out the shop and cafe and all sorts of different bits and pieces. But we ended up back at £183,000 on receipts and expenditure. So receipts and expenditure does not always end at a pound for museums. So anybody who says it does, I'm afraid they're wrong. But again in York, we have a lovely museum, which is Yorkshire Museum, sat in the grounds of the old abbey. You can see the St. Mary's Abbey ruins here. We have various buildings within the grounds, and the grounds themselves are a park. In that case, we have a museum rather more like RAMM, purpose-built from the 1860s, making a huge year-on-year loss. The rateable value there started at 106,000. We went through a number of permutations, but we ended up at £1 because it's a loss-making museum, and there is nothing you can do about that. So other buildings that we looked at that were valued on a receipts and expenditure basis eventually. So here along the river frontage, you have a whole row of buildings, and dropping off the bottom of this photograph, there's a quarter-mile long building that we know as the rope walk, which for obvious reasons is a rope walk. This is a museum, but there's also a lot of lettings going on the site, and it's occupied by a charitable trust, the Chatham Historic Dockyard Trust. The starting point then, if it'll come up, there we go. We had a rateable value in the 2010 list of £430,000, and after one of the buildings was revamped and opened, that increased to £472,500. We finally agreed just a year ago to settle it. And the outcome was rateable value £57,750 and £66,250 when the new building opened, based on receipts, on a percentage of receipts. This is a very, very complex site. The accounts are as complicated as the site is. So we agreed a percentage of receipts, or a very low percentage of receipts, rather than doing anything else with it. Impact on other property types.
Colin, can I jump in there then, and can we deal with impact on other property types as a discussion between us, if that's okay?
Perfect. Yeah.
In my note, I said that there appeared to be a potential for the principles, obviously not the case itself, because the case was limited to a historic museum, a 19th century listed museum, My point was that the principles that led to that decision in that case could be extended to other public buildings not occupied for profit. And I just wanted to go through a few of them with you, just to get a flavour as to how these things might work. First of all, we know that schools, there's a statutory duty to provide adequate school places on the local authority, so they can't say that it's a discretionary spend. But in terms of the approach of the contractors' bases versus others, we also know that the free school market relies quite heavily sometimes on rented buildings rather than constructed buildings. They just rent old community buildings or old office blocks and convert them, or old leisure centres or whatever, or even old schools actually. Once you start to get an evidential base from the free school movement as to rents that are paid in the real world for old schools and for old similar buildings, what's to stop that being used as a benchmark for the whole of the school estate around the country?
As long as we've got a big enough evidential base, I don't see any reason at all why we can't apply it, why we can't look at that and bring it out. In the bullet points I've got on the screen there, the bottom one is emerging rental markets, and this is an emerging rental market. It's a question of the quality of the evidence, it's a question of the volume of the evidence. But as you saw with the museum case for RAMM, the volume of evidence is pretty small.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things in the RAMM case was we got away with relying on a few really quite small museums and really quite small examples that had nothing, which were not factually were not remotely comparable to the RAMM building.
Yeah.
Okay, well, can I push that?
Schools were likely to have a more balanced view when it comes to it, but it may well be that some of the very large state schools have no equivalent in the free school market as yet.
What about for private schools? There's no statutory duty there to be open and to have school places or anything. To what extent is this argument potentially available to private schools or special schools run by charities for particular groups of disabled children, for example?
I don't think it makes any difference whether it's a private school, a state school, or a charity-run school. I think at the end of the day, schools are schools, and we should be looking at them in the same basket. And therefore, if the basket of evidence is there to prove the point, then we should be looking to that evidence and seeing where that evidence takes us.
My local community is about to lose its art centre, its sort of playhouse, and its sports centre because of financial cuts. It's always struck me when I look at the budgets for those that the rates bill is always the second thing on the list. It's always a very, very high driver. Those are discretionary areas. Those are discretionary areas of spend. To what extent is affordability of the rent in the current climate in terms of local authority funding, to what extent do you think affordability issues can be used and rolled out in those sorts of situations?
I think we've got a much stronger case now to roll that forward, but it's back again to the evidence we can get that we're covering quite a wide range of different property types. Certain property types, community centres and what have you, are actually valued on a price per square metre rather than contractors. But whether or not that's the right price per square metre is something that's never really been challenged, and we need to look at that. I was involved for working men's clubs in an appeal that went to Lands Tribunal a few years back. So this was for the 1995 rating list. And again, we're arguing the same thing. We should be looking at receipts and expenditure rather than anything else. Unfortunately, we didn't quite win that case, but it did make a big difference because we were able to demonstrate that the prices being adopted by the VO were just not realistic.
And if we can come back to those individual examples again, just take an arts centre, and we all know art centres that have been leased by local authorities to charitable trusts or to be given away because the local authority doesn't want to run them anymore, old cinemas that are now community ventures and so on. In a situation where there's no statutory duty to run the particular activity, and where, for example, art centres, there is some evidence out there as to rents actually paid or nil rents actually paid for local authorities to get rid of them, which is effectively what the position was in RAMM. They were given the building for nothing. How does that play out in terms of valuation approach?
It depends on what we're looking at in terms of the Arts Centre, because again, there's a mixed approach being adopted by the Valuation Office, but we should be building into it whatever real world evidence there is. And if we've got real world evidence of rents, that should take primacy in our view of how things are done. You and I before this have discussed theatres, which I'm considering and looking at for one of our clients. We have quite a lot of theatres owned by local authorities, let on peppercorn rents, with a tie back to potential for some turnover rent to be paid if the place is profitable, and others where, tied alongside of that, there's a management agreement, so the tenant is actually paid to occupy. So we should be taking all that into account, and right now we're not. And that's an important thing that we need to look at and think about.
And we know from the Eastbourne case and the Bisham Abbey case that leisure centres, for example, are normally treated as discretionary spend that must have been for socioeconomic value. The council must have thought it was worth spending the money. They're quite often grant funded, but now very often they're also leased out to trusts for £1, and there's a reverse premium where the trust is paid to run to subsidise, for example, children on free school meals, for example. That sort of subsidy. Does the analysis apply also to leisure centres then?
Well, I think it should do. When we look at the case that everybody points to and relies on, the Eastbourne case, the problem there is we're not in that financial world anymore. At that time, grants weren't available to the local authorities for sports centres. Now they are. I can't think of a local authority that's going to build a sports centre without getting a grant through the lottery. It just won't happen. So we have a situation that's very different now economically to the one that was there before. And of course, with each revaluation, we should take into account the economic factors at the date of the valuation, not the economic factors from 20, 30 years ago.
I've been asked, I'm now going to pick up on some of the questions that are on the feed. I've answered some of them whilst you've been talking. One question's been raised about NHS hospitals. Very interesting question. Would this analysis apply there at all?
Well, that's a really good question, because there's all sorts of arguments going around about the NHS sector. And ironically, of course, with primary care trusts, the argument went the other way, that with the primary care centres, it was better to do them on contractors than it was to do them on a rental basis, because all the rental evidence was based on PFI schemes and not open market. It had absolutely nothing to do with the open market.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, actually, because I did the schools analysis. I'm chair of governors of some schools, and I did the rating analysis on the contractor spaces and otherwise on my schools. And it turned out that rents from that the free school network paid were much higher than the contractors' bases would yield. So it can cut both ways, I guess, this discussion.
It can. And of course, contractors has always been set as being a ceiling level of value. So if you hit that ceiling, why go above it? Okay. So there is a place for contractors still.
I'm going to pick up on some other questions that have been raised. It's been suggested that that all buildings have socioeconomic benefit, and therefore my focus on buildings occupied for non-profit purposes and for socioeconomic reasons is a misnomer. I think I should make clear that socioeconomic benefits was a term of art that was adopted in York museums and was meant to mean for wider social and wider economic reasons than for profit of the occupation itself. So social was bringing social benefits to your local community. Economic was meant to be bringing tourist benefits to the locality, similar things like that. So it was meant to be in juxtaposition to occupied for profit. But the same person has asked, well, if that's right, surely this just means that there needs to be an alternative basis for valuing cultural assets. My reaction to that is that we have a wide range of valuation methodologies available already. For example, it's been possible to value seaside frontages in the Morecambe case by an overbid situation. On an R&E, they come out at nil, but everyone accepted that a local authority would pay something for them. And I think everyone would accept that a council might well pay something for a leisure centre or an arts centre or a library or even a museum. The question is, what sort of overbid would they pay, or what share of receipts would they pay? And would they, for 1 second, dream of paying a full contractor's basis rent? And the answer seems to me on that to be no.
Yeah, I agree entirely with you on that. I mean, socioeconomic benefit is cultural, educational, all sorts of touchy-feely nice things, which are actually completely incapable of being measured. So the only thing we ever measure is financial.
Absolutely. And then a very interesting question has just come in. That's, I'm not sure I've got my head around it yet, but how does the distinction between discretionary and statutory spending affect the rateable value of a local authority owned property? Does the fact that a property is managed for statutory reasons mean that by definition it can't generate socioeconomic value? Well, the answer to the second bit is definitely not. The fact it's occupied under a statutory duty normally means that it by definition generates masses of socioeconomic value. That's why schools have to be provided for the socioeconomic value they provide. But the real nub of the question is, how does the distinction between discretionary and statutory spending affect the rateable value? And my point is that in a discretionary situation, the local authority has a choice whether to take the building, and a choice as to whether to spend money on it, and therefore affordability will be key. In a statutory situation, the council doesn't have a choice, and so even if it can't afford to build a school or provide a school, it still has to. And so affordability is much less relevant or much less powerful at all when there's a statutory duty. That was meant to be my point there. Colin, have you got anything to add to that?
No, I agree with you entirely there, David. It is a question of, if there is no discretion and the council have got to go out and build this if they don't have it, then contractors really does start to come into its own. But there's still a question at the end of stage 5 as to what adjustments we should make. One of the cases quoted in RAMM, of course, was the Scottish Exhibition Centre case. And there was a 20% allowance made for that by the Scottish assessors themselves because it's a non-commercial occupation. So should we be making adjustments?
Okay, we've got time for one more string of questions, which is, does any of this analysis apply to charitable trusts occupying museums? And my answer is clearly yes. I think you agree with that.
Well, the York case, of course, was on behalf of York Museums and Gallery Trust. So it is a charitable trust case.
And indeed, many of the examples I'm talking about are local authority leisure centres that have been leased to charitable trusts. That's exactly the fact they've been leased for nil is the evidential base for the use of a non-contractor basis approach. And then finally, final question, I'm afraid this is all we've got time for. Presumably all of these alternative valuation methodologies have to be wound back to the AVD, that's correct, which presumably gives rise to further difficulties in evidencing such contentions if the whole basis as to how these buildings are run or operated has changed in the meantime. And that also is correct. So you do need an evidential base as to how the market approached the the valuation exercise at the AVD. You can also obviously look at trends that were evident at the AVD but developed after the AVD. But Colin, do you want to add anything on that?
No, I think you've pinned that down. I did mention that when we're looking at this, we have to look at the financial, economic circumstances at the AVD. If it's changed beyond that, well, it's the next reval that we need to worry about, not the current reval. Okay,
well, I think that's brought us to the end of our time allocated. I think it's going to be quite interesting to watch this space and see what happens. Maybe we'll get together again next year and see what's happened in this area. Can I just say thank you very much for the team behind the scenes who's been controlling everything and marketing it. Thank you very much to Colin and his team there for their input, and thank you above all to everyone for joining this call. We'll try to answer any outstanding questions in the next few minutes remotely. The seminar and the paper will be on the Chamber's website, I think, in the next hour or two. Thank you very much and keep safe. Thank you.
Thank you.